If you're over 60 and worried about clogged arteries, you've probably spent hours searching for the diet that finally protects your heart. And that's where things get confusing, because every search seems to produce another completely different answer. Keto says cut carbohydrates, Mediterranean says prioritize plants, vegan says avoid animal foods, and carnivore says almost everything else. Every camp has studies, experts, testimonials, and confident explanations making you wonder which one you're actually supposed to believe. But here's the question almost nobody asks. What if the diet label isn't actually the most important part? Your arteries don't know whether your breakfast was keto, Mediterranean, vegan, or something you simply decided to try. They respond to what repeatedly happens inside your body after those meals, across weeks, months, and years. And that means there isn't one magical diet that simply enters your arteries and scrubs established plaque away. Instead, there are 3 underlying rules that a genuinely heart-supportive eating pattern should address. And here's where this gets interesting. Completely different diets can potentially meet those same 3 rules. In other words, you may not need to join another diet tribe or completely rebuild your life around another label. You need to understand what your body is actually responding to every day. In this video, I'll show you those 3 rules, then show you exactly what they can look like on a real plate. But there's another reason this matters, especially after 60, when protecting cardiovascular health becomes increasingly important. Some measurements from your annual physical tell you something valuable, but they don't tell you everything about your cardiovascular risk. And one of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming one normal number means everything inside their arteries must be fine. So we're going to look underneath the obvious numbers and focus on the patterns that actually matter. By the end, you'll know how to evaluate keto, Mediterranean, plant-based, lower carb, or almost any other eating pattern. You'll also understand which things you can monitor yourself and which ones require proper medical testing. So let's begin with rule number 1. Because this is where your everyday meals can reveal something your annual checkup may miss. The first rule is supporting healthy glucose regulation, especially what happens to your blood sugar after you eat. And before you start blaming carbohydrates, understand something important. The issue isn't simply whether a food contains carbs. What matters is the overall glucose response, your metabolic health, your activity, and how frequently your blood sugar becomes elevated. Your arteries have an inner lining called the endothelium, and that lining plays an important role in vascular health. Think of it as a remarkably active interface constantly responding to everything moving through your bloodstream. When metabolic health becomes impaired, endothelial function can also become impaired, which is one reason glucose regulation matters. But don't make the mistake of believing there's one universal post-meal glucose number that proves your arteries are being damaged. There isn't. The more useful question is whether your glucose regulation is consistently healthy across meals, days, and months. And to understand why that matters, imagine someone will call Mike. Mike is 61, and every year his fasting glucose comes back looking reassuring. His doctor sees the result, tells him it looks fine, and Mike goes home believing blood sugar isn't something he needs to think about. But Mike's breakfast is usually a large bowl of cereal, and lunch often means a sandwich loaded with bread. Nothing about those meals seems outrageous, especially when he's comparing himself with people eating fast food every day. Then Mike starts paying attention to what happens after those meals. He notices that his glucose response is dramatically different after certain meals than after others. Suddenly, his morning fasting number doesn't tell the entire story he thought it did. The lesson isn't that cereal or bread automatically damages someone's arteries. The lesson is that your body's response to food can reveal information that one annual measurement completely misses. That's why glucose monitoring can help reveal patterns, while remembering that no home glucose device can determine whether arterial plaque is disappearing. But controlling your glucose response is only the first piece, because there's another problem that can hide inside a supposedly healthy diet. You can improve one metabolic marker while still building your meals around foods that offer very little nutritional value. That's why rule number 2 is building your diet around minimally processed, nutrient-dense foods that support overall cardiovascular health. And no, this isn't about labeling individual foods as either inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. Human biology doesn't work like a simple list where one ingredient automatically determines your cardiovascular future. What matters much more is the pattern you repeat most often. Think vegetables, fruits, legumes, where appropriate quality protein, fiber, healthy fats, and foods that retain substantial nutritional value. At the same time, pay attention to heavily processed foods that can make refined carbohydrates, added sugars, sodium, and excess calories extremely easy to consume. This is where the modern food environment creates a problem without making it feel like a problem. A packaged breakfast doesn't feel dangerous, and neither does an afternoon snack or a refined dinner. But repeat those choices hundreds of times, and your overall dietary pattern starts looking very different. Research consistently finds associations between higher ultra-processed food intake and poorer cardiovascular outcomes. That doesn't mean every packaged food causes plaque, and it doesn't mean one occasional snack determines your heart health. It means the overall dietary pattern deserves far more attention than the name printed on your diet plan. And here's where Mike's story gets more interesting. He didn't consider himself a junk food addict, so he assumed his diet was reasonably healthy. Then he wrote down everything he ate during one ordinary day. Breakfast had refined grains, lunch included packaged food, his afternoon snack came from a box, and dinner contained another highly processed side. Nothing looked catastrophic by itself, but together they created a pattern Mike hadn't recognized before. That's rule number 2. Build your everyday diet around nutrient-dense, minimally processed foods rather than relying on a healthy-sounding label. Now we've reached the third rule, and this is where most diet arguments suddenly become much less interesting. Because once you stop arguing about labels, you have to ask a much more practical question. Is your diet actually nourishing you? Your body needs protein, vitamins, minerals, fiber, essential fats, and other nutrients to maintain normal tissues and metabolic function. That doesn't mean any particular vitamin magically clears plaque, because cardiovascular disease is far more complicated than one nutrient. But consistently poor nutrition can undermine the health you're trying to improve, and this becomes especially important as you move through your 60s, 70s, and beyond, because there's another thing that quietly changes with age. Maintaining muscle becomes harder unless you actively work to preserve it. And muscle isn't just about how strong you feel when carrying groceries or climbing stairs. Muscle is an important site for glucose uptake, particularly after meals, which connects muscle health with metabolic health. Now imagine Mike again, but 6 months later. He has spent months worrying about which foods to eliminate, but almost no time thinking about maintaining his strength. His meals are smaller, his activity hasn't improved much, and his protein intake has become inconsistent. Eventually, he realizes something important. Improving his diet isn't only about removing harmful choices. It's also about replacing them with enough nutritious food to support the body he wants to maintain. That's why a poorly planned keto diet can fail nutritionally, just as a poorly planned vegan diet can. The label doesn't guarantee adequate protein, micronutrients, fiber, or overall food quality. The same principle works in reverse. A carefully planned diet can succeed regardless of whether its label says Mediterranean, lower carb, plant forward, or something else. So here's the framework. Support healthy glucose regulation. Build your diet around nutrient-dense, minimally processed foods, and protect muscle with adequate protein and activity. Those are the 3 rules to remember, and they're far more useful than memorizing another diet label. But knowing the 3 rules is easy. The real question is what they look like when you actually sit down for dinner. So let's take everything we've discussed and put it onto a real plate, because that's where theory finally becomes useful. Start with minimally processed foods and build the meal around a quality protein source, vegetables, fiber, and appropriate healthy fats. A Mediterranean-style meal can do this extremely well, but it isn't the only approach capable of meeting these principles. A carefully designed lower-carb diet can work too, provided the food quality and nutritional adequacy are there. A whole food plant-forward diet can work as well, provided protein and essential nutrients are properly covered. The mistake is thinking that removing carbohydrates, meat, dairy, or any single category automatically makes everything left on your plate healthy. For one meal, you might have eggs with vegetables, plain yogurt with berries and nuts, or another protein-rich whole food combination. Another meal could be salmon or chicken alongside broccoli, leafy greens, beans, lentils, or another appropriate high-fiber food. Add healthy fats from foods such as olive oil, nuts, seeds, avocado, or fish, depending on the overall dietary pattern. Notice what's missing. You don't need an expensive artery cleansing powder, miracle supplement, or secret ingredient. And now comes the part that separates a theory from something you can actually evaluate. Depending on your individual situation, your doctor can monitor things like blood pressure, cholesterol, triglycerides, A1C, glucose, weight, and waist circumference. Those measurements can help you understand whether important cardiovascular risk factors are moving in a favorable direction. But don't make the mistake of treating a home glucose reading as proof that arterial plaque has disappeared. It can't tell you that. If you have diagnosed heart disease, diabetes, kidney disease, or take cardiovascular medication, discuss significant dietary changes with your healthcare professional. The best dietary pattern isn't necessarily the most extreme one. It's the one that supports your health and remains sustainable. Now you understand the bigger idea. 3 rules matter more than one diet label. Healthy glucose regulation, nutrient-dense minimally processed foods, and enough protein and activity to protect muscle. But knowing the rules is only half the story, because there's still one question almost everyone asks after learning this framework. Which specific food deserves the most attention? In the next video, I'll show you the food with some of the most interesting cardiovascular evidence behind it, and separate what the research actually supports from the promises the internet has exaggerated.